What if I told you that the famous pioneer feasts we see in movies are just a cool fantasy? In reality, the Wild West was a world of hunger, cold, and constant shortages. People didn't have feasts around the campfire. They struggled just to eat. Every meal was a step between life and exhaustion, and the romance disappeared as soon as the flour and salt ran out. The real food of the frontier was harsh, primitive, and tasteless. Instead of game, there was dried meat or salted beef. Instead of bread, there were flatbreads made from water and flour, sometimes even from flour mixed with ash. Butter and sugar were considered luxuries, and a spoonful of lard was a real delicacy. Pioneers survived on fatty foods because they provided energy when nothing else was available. When supplies ran low, they used whatever they could cook. They cooked thick soups from the leftovers, adding roots, herbs, and even dried animal skins. Sometimes several families shared one pot of food, and each person received only a few spoonfuls. Such meals were not a celebration, but a test of endurance, both physical and moral. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn what the pioneers' diet actually consisted of, why lard was more expensive than gold, what real migrant camps smelled like, and what single product accompanied them for weeks, becoming their breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival on the frontier, and it will shock you. This secret was not a rifle or a horse, but a simple corn cob. For settlers moving west, corn was the absolute basis of survival, much more important than wheat or rye. It was undemanding, grew in poor soil, yielded a huge harvest of calories per acre, and could be stored almost indefinitely in dried form. Pioneers planted it as soon as they cleared a piece of land, even before their houses were built. Corn was not eaten on the cob, as we are accustomed to today. Its main form was coarsely ground cornmeal, or cornmeal. It was a versatile substance that made up most dishes. The grains were dried and then ground by hand on heavy stone millstones, which was an exhausting daily task in itself. The quality of the grinding determined the texture of the future food, but most often it was coarse, with hard particles. The main dish made from this flour was a porridge known as mash, or mamliga. It was an extremely simple dish. Corn flour was slowly poured into a pot of boiling salted water and cooked until it reached a thick, sticky consistency. In the morning, it was eaten hot with a little milk if available, or simply washed down with water. It was a quick and cheap way to fill your stomach with calories before a long day of physical labor. In the evening, the same porridge could serve as dinner, but with the addition of a small amount of fat or lard for satiety. The cooled porridge solidified into a dense mass. The next day, this mass could be cut into slices and fried in a pan with fat. Such fried porridge was a popular breakfast as it saved time on cooking. Another common dish was Johnny cakes, or corn cakes. This was the same corn flour mixed with water or buttermilk, salt, and possibly a pinch of baking soda, if it was available. The batter was poured onto a hot grease skillet or baked directly on a board leaning against the fire. These cakes replaced bread, which was often unavailable. Another option was cornbread. Unlike flatbread, it was baked in a heavy cast iron mold or Dutch oven directly in the coals of the fire. It was dense, filling, and very different from the fluffy, sweet cornbread we know today. It was often the only main course to accompany a plate of beans or soup. Corn was so ubiquitous that it was even used to make a drink. Roasted corn kernels were ground and brewed with boiling water to make a coffee substitute. This drink did not contain caffeine, but it gave the illusion of a hot, familiar drink far from civilization. It was bitter, but it warmed you up and helped you cope with the morning cold. For the pioneers, corn was both a salvation and a curse. Eating the same dish, essentially porridge in different forms, 3 times a day, week after week, was psychologically difficult. A monotonous diet consisting almost entirely of corn did not provide all the necessary nutrients. This was the price settlers paid for a reliable and affordable source of calories. Survival on the frontier meant constantly looking for ways to make corn edible. They mixed it with whatever they could get their hands on: wild berries, leftover meat fat, a handful of beans. But at the core, it was always corn. coarse, yellow flour that became the foundation of the settlement of the West. Without it, expansion into the plains would have been simply impossible. We often romanticize simple food, but what is it like to eat only corn for months on end? I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about such a mono diet? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to learn more about real life on the frontier. Are you ready to learn the truth about what bread really was in the Wild West? Forget about soft rolls. Pioneers had two main types of bread, and both were symbols of survival rather than culinary art. Rock-hard galettes and living, high-maintenance sourdough bread. The first and simplest was hardtack, or galette. It was Army and Navy food, which the pioneers quickly adopted for their long journeys across the plains. The recipe was elementary: flour, water, and salt. Sometimes even more salt was added for extra preservation. The dough was rolled out and baked until it was rock hard to completely remove moisture. This bread could be stored not just for months, but for years. It was unaffected by heat or cold. The problem was that it was almost impossible to eat. The galettes were so hard that they were jokingly called tooth destroyers, or sheet iron. Trying to bite off a piece of dry hardtack was a sure way to damage your teeth. To eat a biscuit, it had to be softened. The most common way was to dip it in a mug of hot coffee. The biscuit absorbed the liquid, turning into an edible, albeit tasteless, mush at the bottom of the mug. Soldiers and pioneers also crumbled it into soup or broth, using it as a thickener. Another method was to break the galette into small pieces with a rifle butt or a stone. These crumbs were then mixed with water and a small amount of fat and fried in a pan. This dish was called scouse and was considered almost a delicacy, as it was hot and contained fat. If galettes were food for the long journey, then sourdough or sourdough reigned supreme at camps and farms. In conditions where it was impossible to obtain commercial yeast, sourdough was the only way to get risen bread. It was a living culture of wild yeast and bacteria in a mixture of flour and water. Every family or gold prospector guarded their sourdough like the apple of their eye. It was stored in a special pot or wooden barrel. The sourdough had to be fed every day by adding a new portion of flour and water and protected from frost. Losing the sourdough meant losing the ability to bake bread. Sourdough bread was dense, with a characteristic sour note. It was not like the exquisite loaves from modern bakeries. It was simple, hearty bread, baked in heavy cast iron Dutch ovens directly in the coals of a fire. The crust was hard and the crumb was moist and filling. Sourdough was used to make more than just bread. In the morning, it was used to make fluffy pancakes or flapjacks, which were fried in a greased skillet. It was a quick and filling breakfast that provided energy for the whole day. Sourdough was the heart of frontier cuisine. Trappers and gold miners who spent months in the mountains carried their sourdough with them in pouches around their necks, warming it with their own body heat. This is where their nickname sourdough came from, which became synonymous with an experienced old-timer or prospector. Sourdough was their constant, albeit capricious, companion. Thus, bread on the frontier was either dead and eternal, like hardtack, or alive and demanding, like sourdough. Both options required labor and patience. Which of these two types of bread would you choose for survival? In the next chapter, we'll talk about what the pioneers spread on this bread, and it's definitely not butter. What you are about to learn about meat in the Wild West will forever change your perception of cowboy steaks. In fact, fresh meat was a rarity for most pioneers. Their main, and often only, source of animal protein was salt pork, or salt pork. And it was one of the harshest tests for their stomachs. Salt pork is not the juicy meat we imagine. Most often, it was pure pork fat with virtually no meat marbling. The carcasses were cut up, and the best pieces were sent to cities for sale, while the rest, mainly fatty belly and lard, was sent to farms and settler convoys. This was logical. Fat contained twice as many calories as protein, and calories were the main currency of survival. The preservation process was brutally simple. Pieces of fat and fatty meat were placed in wooden barrels and generously sprinkled with large amounts of salt. The barrels were then filled with a supersaturated salt solution, brine. Salt was the only preservative available, and it was used sparingly. The result was a product that could be stored for years without refrigeration, did not spoil in the heat, and could withstand any shaking in a wagon. A barrel of salted meat was as essential an attribute of a pioneer wagon train as a sack of cornmeal. But this preservation came at a high price. The product was so salty that it was impossible to eat raw. It was as hard as wood and tasted like salt rock. Before cooking, the salted meat had to be soaked in fresh water for many hours, and sometimes for a whole day. The water had to be changed several times to remove at least some of the salt. Even after soaking, salted meat remained incredibly salty and tough. It was never eaten as a dish on its own. Its main function was to serve as a source of fat and salt for other foods. A small piece of salted meat was thrown into a pot of beans or soup. During cooking, the salted meat released its fat and salt, making the tasteless beans or water more satisfying and flavorful. It was the flavor enhancer of the frontier era. The piece of fat left over after long cooking was eaten so that not a single calorie would be wasted, even though it was an unappetizing substance. Small pieces of salted meat fried in a pan were called screeching meat because of the sound they made. The rendered fat was used to fry corn tortillas or potatoes. The remaining cracklings were added to porridge for satiety. Sometimes, when there was no other option, the pioneers ate thin slices of raw, unsoaked salted meat. It was an act of desperation, but it provided the necessary energy. The water in which the salted meat was soaked was not wasted either. It was used as a salty broth for hunger soups. Salted meat was a symbol of survival against all odds. It was food that was not liked, but on which life depended. It provided calories, fat, and the necessary salt, without which the human body cannot function under conditions of hard physical labor. It was harsh, uncompromising food for harsh times. If this harsh truth about the pioneers' food impressed you, like this video. Most often, they were dried pinto beans or navy beans. Like salt pork, they took a long time to cook. Dried beans were soaked overnight, if possible, and then simmered over low heat for many hours. A pot of beans often simmered on the edge of the campfire all day long. The beans themselves were bland. Their culinary magic lay in what was added to them. Almost always that same piece of salted meat went into the pot. It slowly melted its fat and salt, turning the water and beans into a thick, hearty stew. It was the perfect combination. The beans provided protein and carbohydrates, and the salted meat provided fat and calories. This dish was the staple of cowboys' diet during cattle drives. The cook, known as the cookie, would get up before dawn to put the pot of beans on the fire. By evening, when the tired herders returned to camp, a hot, hearty, and high-calorie meal awaited them. They ate it straight from bowls, scooping it up with corn tortillas. Beans were not only dinner, but also breakfast. The leftovers from the evening were reheated and served in the morning, often with black coffee. It was heavy food, but it provided the energy needed for a 12-hour workday in the saddle or behind the plow. When there were no beans or salted meat, it was time for hungry soups. These were soups based on the principle of whatever is in the pot. The base was water, which they tried to make at least a little nutritious. Anything they could find could go into it. If there were crumbs of biscuits or stale cornbread left in the wagon, they were thrown into the boiling water to thicken it. If they managed to find a few wild onions or roots, they were also thrown into the pot. Sometimes the only meat ingredient was an empty sack that had once been used to store flour. It was boiled to collect the last remnants. The most common hunger soup was a simple broth left over from soaking salted meat. This salty water already had a certain meaty aroma. A handful of cornmeal could be added to it to make a thin, salty porridge. It was meager fare, but it was hot and gave the illusion of food. These soups and broths were the food of desperation. They were not meant to satisfy hunger, but only to trick the stomach and provide warmth. Nevertheless, hot liquid food was important for maintaining strength in cold weather. It helped stretch meager supplies until the next opportunity to get something more substantial. The pioneers were masters at stretching food. A single potato or onion could be the basis for a whole pot of soup that fed a family. This ability to create food from practically nothing was one of the main survival skills. What do you think you would put in your hunger soup under those conditions? In the next chapter, we'll learn how pioneers used the main source of calories that everyone tries to avoid today. In our modern world, fat is considered the enemy. We look for low-fat foods and count calories. But for settlers in the Wild West, fat was not the enemy, but their most valuable friend. In conditions of constant physical labor and food shortages, fat was synonymous with energy, warmth, and survival. Calories were the main goal of any meal, and fat was their most concentrated source. 1 gram of fat provided twice as much energy as a gram of carbohydrates or protein. Therefore, pioneers instinctively sought out fatty foods. It was a biological necessity, not a culinary preference. The main source of fat was pork. Pigs were valued not so much for their meat as for their fat. After slaughtering the animal, the fat was carefully cut off and melted over low heat. The result was pure white lard. It was poured into clay pots or wooden barrels, where it solidified and could be stored for months. Lard was a versatile product in the kitchen. It replaced butter, which most settlers did not have. It was spread thickly on cornbread or flatbread. It was a simple and incredibly high-calorie food that gave strength for working in the fields. Lard was the main cooking medium. Everything was fried in it, from slices of solidified corn porridge to wild Johnny cakes. It was added to bread dough to make it more filling and soft. Without lard, it was impossible to imagine the baked goods of that time. The cracklings left over after rendering the lard were also put to good use. These crispy, high-calorie pieces were almost a delicacy. They were added to porridge, beans, or simply eaten as a snack, sprinkled with salt. No part of this valuable product was wasted. If there was no lard, any available fat was used. The fat rendered from salted meat was carefully collected and used for frying. Its salty taste added extra flavor to bland cornmeal. This fat was so valuable that the pan was often not washed after frying, but wiped with bread. Even when the pioneers managed to catch game, they valued the fat first and foremost. Bison or deer meat was often very lean. Trappers and hunters valued beavers or bears precisely for their fat reserves. Bear fat was considered especially valuable and was used both for food and as medicine. Fat was not only food, but also fuel. It was used to make homemade candles that lit up dark log cabins. It was used to lubricate wagon axles and care for leather harnesses. It was a versatile and indispensable resource. It is difficult for modern people to understand this reverence for fat, but for a person who expended thousands of calories a day, swinging an axe or walking behind a plow, fat was the difference between being able to work and being exhausted. It was pure, concentrated energy, fuel for the human machine in the harsh conditions of the frontier. What if I told you that pioneers discovered the secret to survival literally under their feet? When supplies of flour and salted meat were running low, and the new harvest was still far away, a family's life depended on what could be found right in nature. Foraging was not a pastime, but a critical skill that often saved them from starvation. It became a vital part of daily life when food supplies were rapidly depleting and the time until the next harvest seemed endless. Women and older family members, possessing the necessary knowledge, spent long hours searching the surrounding meadows, forests, and fields for edible plants and root vegetables. It was not an enjoyable activity, but a cruel necessity. Many plants that we now consider weeds were the very sources of food that allowed the pioneers to survive in the most difficult times. One such plant was dandelion leaves, which became one of the first fresh green additions to the diet in the spring, after a long winter spent on dried foods and salted meat. Dandelion leaves were bitter to the taste, but the pioneers learned to soak them in salt water to remove the bitterness. After that, they could be eaten raw, but more often than not, they were boiled. Boiled dandelion greens were not a delicacy, but a way to get at least some nutrients. It was a way, among other things, to make life easier after a long winter, when fresh produce was a luxury and the diet consisted mainly of cheap, long-lasting staples, such as dried meat and flour. It was this humble meal consisting of common weeds that could play a crucial role in surviving until the new harvest. Another important plant that settlers actively used was nettles. Young nettle shoots were harvested before they became too tough and stinging. Nettles were considered not just edible, but a valuable addition to the daily diet. To get rid of the sting, nettles were scalded with boiling water and then boiled in soup or stewed with a small amount of fat. Nettles were rich in vitamins and minerals, and when combined with other plants, they became a useful source of nutrients needed to maintain strength during the long winter months. In addition, settlers actively gathered wild onions, wild garlic, and chicory. These plants were important additions to the diet, adding variety to everyday foods such as plain porridge or beans. Chicory roots, among other things, were dried, roasted, and ground, turning them into a popular coffee substitute. When regular coffee was unavailable, this powder became a real lifesaver, allowing people to feel a little bit at home by giving their drinks their familiar aroma. Picking wild berries was a real treat for the settlers. Wild raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, and strawberries were a rare source of sweetness in their diet. They were eaten fresh and also dried for the winter to add a little variety to their food during the cold months. Sometimes the berries were cooked with a small amount of sugar if it was available, and this became a real luxury. These supplies were kept for special occasions, as sweetness in conditions of constant food shortages was perceived as a gift from fate. Nuts such as hickory, pecan, and black walnut played an important role in the diet, providing settlers with fats and proteins. In the fall, the whole family would go out to gather nuts. They were dried, stored, and then, during cold winter evenings, cracked open and added to baked goods or eaten on their own to keep up strength. Nuts, rich in fats, provided the necessary energy, especially when dinner consisted only of root vegetable soup and a small piece of meat. Knowledge of edible plants was a vital skill for every settler, and many of them learned from the local Native American tribes who had survived on these lands for centuries. Pioneers mastered local methods of gathering and processing plants, learning which roots could be dug up and cooked, which leaves were safe, and which could be dangerous. Misidentifying a plant could be very costly, as the lives of entire families depended on it. Many plants that at first glance might have seemed like ordinary weeds became the main sources of food and vitamins when all other supplies were nearly exhausted. Often these wild plants were the only source of vitamins in a diet that consisted mainly of flour, fat, and salt. These plants helped prevent diseases associated with poor nutrition. Of course, the pioneers did not know about vitamins, but they intuitively felt that after a plate of boiled nettles or fresh berries, they felt better. It was a matter of survival, where every wild root or bush they found was a step towards salvation. This foot food was a symbol of adaptation. It showed how pioneers learned to live in a new land, using its resources, which they learned to trust. This diet was not a luxury, but a necessity. Every day was a battle for survival, in which a basket and a knife became the most important tools. And patience and perseverance were the keys to success. Do you think you could survive on a diet of wild plants and weeds alone? In the next chapter, we will talk about the food of those who did not stay in one place, mountain hunters. We will examine how their diet, full of meat and wild plants, was linked to the difficulties of survival in conditions of constant movement and hunting. Not everyone who settled the West was a farmer. Mountain hunters, or mountain men, and trappers lived a completely different life. They spent months and even years away from settlements in the wild Rocky Mountains. Their diet was adapted for maximum mobility, and its basis was pemmican. Pemmican is perhaps the most effective survival food ever invented by man. It was invented by the indigenous peoples of North America and quickly adopted by trappers. The recipe was simple but labor-intensive. It consisted of only two main ingredients: dried meat and rendered fat. Bison meat was most often used to make pemmican. The meat was cut into thin strips and dried in the sun or over a slow fire until it became brittle, like glass. It was important to remove all moisture so that the product would not spoil. Then the dried meat was placed on a stone or skin and crushed with another stone or hammer into a fine powder, almost like flour. This process was long and tedious. The resulting meat flour was the basis of the dish. The fat, most often bison fat, was melted separately. The fat was melted over low heat until it became clear and liquid. All cracklings and connective tissue residues were carefully removed from it. Only the purest melted fat, or tallow, was used. Finally, the two ingredients were mixed together. Meat powder was poured into a bag made of rawhide, and hot rendered fat was poured over it. Sometimes dried wild berries, such as erga or cranberries, were added to the mixture for flavor and nutrients. The fat soaked into the meat powder and, as it solidified, turned the whole mass into a hard, dense briquette. The result was a product with an incredible concentration of calories. Pemmican was light because it contained no water, but it was extremely nutritious. A small piece could sustain a person's strength for a whole day of hard physical labor, such as canoeing or crossing a mountain pass. Pemmican did not spoil for years. It could be eaten in any form. Most often, it was simply chewed dry, breaking off pieces with a knife. It was a hard, fatty, and not very appetizing-looking mass, but it provided an instant burst of energy. Sometimes pemmican was crumbled into a pot of boiling water. The result was a thick, fatty, and very filling soup or stew. Trappers called this soup rhubarb. It was the only hot meal they could afford on long winter trips. Pemmican was the ideal food for the frontier. It was compact, durable, and high in calories. For a trapper whose backpack was his only home, pemmican was more important than gold. It was concentrated life packed into a skin bag. Although pemmican was the food of hunters, the technology for making it was also known to pioneers. Families moving west often took a supply of pemmican with them in case of unforeseen circumstances. It was a strategic reserve of calories for the most extreme situations. If corn was the summer king of the fields, root vegetables were the humble saviors of the long, cold winter. On the frontier, the ability to survive the winter depended directly on how well the cellar was stocked, and it was filled mainly not with delicacies, but with the simplest and most durable vegetables. The main heroes of winter survival were potatoes, rutabagas, and parsnips. These crops were not as demanding as wheat, produced a stable yield, and most importantly, could be stored for months in a cool, dark place. Building a good root cellar was as important a task as building a house. Potatoes were definitely the favorite. They could be cooked in dozens of different ways, which brought at least some variety to the monotonous diet. They were baked directly in the coals of the fire until the skin was charred and the flesh was soft. It was a simple and hearty dinner. Potatoes were boiled in their skins and eaten with salt and lard. They were sliced and fried in a pan in the fat left over from salted meat. They were mashed and mixed with cornmeal to make flatbread. Every part of the potato was put to use. Rutabaga was less popular, but no less important. It had a reputation as a food of despair because of its pungent smell and distinctive taste. However, rutabaga was incredibly hardy. It could grow in poor soil and withstand light frosts, and its roots were large and nutritious. Rutabaga was most often boiled or stewed. It was added to hunger soups and stews to give them thickness and volume. Due to its strong flavor, it was able to refine even the simplest broth. It was often cooked together with potatoes to soften the taste. Parsnips were another hearty root vegetable. Their sweet, spicy taste was a pleasant addition to the diet. Parsnips were often left in the ground for the whole winter and dug up only in the spring. It was believed that frost made them even sweeter. They were boiled or baked in the same way as potatoes. Having these root vegetables in the cellar meant the difference between a well-fed winter and a hungry one. When blizzards swept the roads and communication with the outside world was cut off, the family could survive on their stores of potatoes, rutabagas, and salted meat. It was simple, heavy food, but it was reliable. In addition to these three giants, the pioneers grew turnips and carrots, but they were more capricious. Turnips were popular, but they did not store as well as rutabagas. Carrots required more fertile soil. which was often lacking in newly settled lands. The winter diet was a test of endurance, not only physical, but also moral. Eating boiled rutabaga day after day was not easy, but everyone who sat down at the table understood that this humble, earthy food was the only barrier between their family and starvation. These vegetables were not exciting. They were a basic, coarse, but absolutely necessary part of the survival system. They were calories that could be put in the bank in the fall and withdrawn throughout the long winter. In a world where food was primarily fuel, there was one product that was valued not for its calories but for its ritual. That product was coffee. A mug of the hot, bitter drink was not just a source of energy, but a symbol of stability and order in the chaotic life of a pioneer, cowboy, or trapper. Coffee was not a luxury, but a real necessity that became an almost obligatory part of everyday life. In the Wild West, coffee was much more than just a drink. It was a way to stay connected to the familiar world and a reminder that even in the most difficult conditions, it was possible to find a moment of comfort. Pioneers, like many soldiers on the frontier, carried coffee with them in wagons, often not in ground form, but as whole green beans stored in large sacks. This requirement became so important that coffee was included in the official army ration. Soldiers at border forts, serving in the most remote and harsh places, received their daily ration of coffee. It is difficult to overestimate the importance of this drink for those who lived in such conditions, where every day was a struggle for survival. Sometimes coffee was not only a source of cheerfulness, but also a source of moral support. The coffee beans were roasted right on site in the camps. It was a laborious and important process that required special skill. A regular frying pan was used for roasting, which was placed over an open fire. The beans had to be stirred constantly so that they would not burn. It was a task that required attention and care, and those who knew how to roast coffee properly became valuable members of the camp. The aroma of roasting coffee wafting through the camp in the morning was not only a signal for the start of a new day, but also a kind of psychological support. In conditions of loneliness and hardship, this smell was a reminder that life went on despite all the difficulties. After the beans were roasted, they were ground. Mills, if they were available in the camp, were used for this purpose. But more often than not, the beans were wrapped in cloth and crushed with a rifle butt or a stone. The grinding was rough and not as uniform as we are used to today, but that did not matter much. The main thing was to preserve the taste that was already familiar and habitual. The essence was not in the process, but in the drink itself. Coffee was brewed in the simplest way possible. Ground beans were thrown directly into a pot of cold water and placed on the fire. The coffee was brought to a boil, allowed to rise several times, and then removed from the heat so that the grounds would not flow out. To make it settle to the bottom, a pinch of salt or a little cold water was sometimes added to the pot. This method was simple but effective, and in conditions of limited resources, when other methods of cooking were impossible, coffee became a real lifesaver. Coffee was drunk black, without sugar, and certainly without milk. Sugar was a very expensive and rare commodity that was saved for special occasions. Milk was often not available for sale, and if it was used in the most necessary situations. The pioneers' coffee was strong, bitter, and very hot. It was drunk from tin mugs that burned the lips. It was a drink that did not bring pleasure in the usual sense of the word. It was necessary to warm up, get energy, and feel at least some sense of normality amid endless labor. Coffee served several important functions. First, it provided energy, helping settlers and soldiers stay active and focused in difficult conditions. However, in reality, the pioneers valued not so much the caffeine as the ritual of preparing and drinking coffee. This process became an important part of the morning ritual and the overall organization of the day. The hot liquid warmed them from the inside, especially in the cold morning hours when the air was filled with freshness and cold. Secondly, coffee was an important social ritual. A pot of coffee boiled on the fire all day long. Any guest who arrived at a camp or ranch was first offered a cup of coffee. It was a sign of hospitality and friendliness, the basis of communication on the frontier. Serving coffee on a ranch was much more than just offering a drink. It was a sign of respect, a sign that the visitor was expected and warmly welcome. Thirdly, coffee was indispensable when paired with hardtack, hard biscuits that were used as a staple food in conditions of limited supply. As we have already mentioned, this was the only way to soften these hard, rock-like biscuits. A mug of hot coffee with hardtack crumbs soaked in it was often the only breakfast a cowboy or soldier had, which required strength and energy for work. When real coffee ran out, the era of substitutes began. Pioneers and settlers were incredibly inventive in their search for replacements. They roasted and ground rye, barley, corn, dried peas, and chicory roots. These substitutes did not contain caffeine, but they were hot, bitter, and dark, creating the illusion of real coffee. It was a kind of psychological relief, an attempt to preserve at least part of the familiar way of life. Chicory was perhaps the most popular substitute. It was easy to grow and was available both in the wild and in gardens. Chicory produced a thick, dark drink with a recognizable bitterness. This tradition was so deep-rooted that in some regions, such as New Orleans, coffee with chicory is still popular and an integral part of the local culture. We have looked at 12 foods that helped the pioneers survive. But the history of this food is not just a collection of recipes. It is a harsh lesson in adaptation, mistakes, and the price people paid for settling new lands. Food on the frontier was not just sustenance. It was a means of survival on which the lives of families and communities depended. And any mistake in its production or storage could be fatal for the settlers. In the Wild West, food was much more than just a consumer product. It was part of a survival strategy and a decisive factor in the battle for life in uninhabited lands. Many settlers arriving in the West were not prepared for the harsh conditions they encountered. They brought with them wheat seeds, a familiar crop that had been the staple of their diet back home. But they did not know that in the dry and arid lands of the Great Plains, it simply could not grow without proper irrigation. Early attempts to grow wheat often ended in failure, leaving families without a harvest and, consequently, without food for the winter. This experience was painful, and the settlers realized that they had to change their approach to agriculture if they wanted to survive. It was these mistakes that led them to corn, a crop that had been grown and used by indigenous peoples for centuries. They began to learn from those who knew this land and had tamed it. Corn, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters, became the basis for growing crops. These three plants, which grow close together and support each other, are the perfect model for surviving drought and unpredictable weather conditions. Corn grew, providing vertical support for beans, which in turn enriched the soil with nitrogen, while pumpkins spread across the ground protected the roots from overheating. It was an example of natural symbiosis that allowed settlers to better adapt to new conditions. Survival also depended on the ability to plan. Pioneers could not afford to eat all their food at once. They had to calculate very precisely how much grain to leave for sowing, how much for the winter, and how much for food in the off-season. A mistake in calculations meant that in the spring, he would have nothing to plant, and in the winter, nothing to eat. Such planning required not only knowledge, but also experience, which was accumulated over time in the process of working the land. For settlers in the West, every day was crucial in this regard. Storing food was no less difficult than growing it. Grain had to be protected from rodents and moisture, and meat had to be immediately salted or dried so that it would not spoil. Storing food in conditions of constant dampness or intense heat required maximum effort. Root vegetables such as potatoes and carrots needed a proper cellar where the temperature remained stable and humidity was controlled. Any oversight in storage, miscalculation, or improper storage could result in the loss of an entire summer's work. Settlers learned to store food in a variety of conditions, using all available means, from underground storage to containers that protected against moisture and rodents. However, the psychological aspect of living on such a diet was enormous. The monotony of the diet was exhausting and led to fatigue, depression, and loss of morale. Imagine months when your diet consists only of corn porridge and salted meat. The lack of variety in the diet, the absence of fresh vegetables and fruits, and limited access to vitamins affected not only physical condition, but also psycho-emotional health. These harsh living conditions left their mark on the settler's psyche. Small pleasures, such as a handful of wild berries picked in the forest or a spoonful of molasses, were incredibly valuable. They became not just an addition to food, but a reminder of normal life, that beyond hard work, everything could be easier. A jar of sugar or honey was a real treasure, used only on major holidays or special occasions. These small pleasures became an important part of the psychological support that sustained the settlers' spirits. A diet focused on high-calorie foods such as fat, salt, and corn was effective for survival in conditions of hard physical labor. Such food provided the calories necessary for work, but it did not provide a complete set of all the nutrients necessary for the normal functioning of the body. A lack of vitamins and minerals could lead to various diseases, such as scurvy, which often occurred in those who did not have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. We can see that the real diet of the Wild West was far from the romantic myths. It was a harsh school of survival based on three pillars: corn, salted meat, and beans. Every meal, whether it was a rock-hard biscuit or a tasteless stew, was the result of a compromise between what people wanted and what was possible. This food is not about cooking, but about human resilience. It tells the story of how people adapted to unimaginable conditions, learned from their mistakes, and used every available resource to build a new life. It is a story of calories that were more important than taste, and fat that was more valuable than gold. What other aspects of survival in the Wild West would you like us to cover? Perhaps you are interested in building temporary shelters, methods of obtaining water, or survival tactics in a blizzard. Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new harsh stories from the American frontier.